March 21st, 1918, 4:40 a.m., the Somme Valley, France. British Second Lieutenant Geoffrey Dugdale, huddled in a trench somewhere near Saint-Quentin, trying to light a cigarette in the pre-dawn darkness, while his hands shook from something that wasn't quite cold. The 28-year-old had survived 3 years of Western Front horror. The Somme, Passchendaele, winters that froze men solid in their positions. He'd seen everything this war could throw at him. Then the world exploded. 6,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across a 50-mile front. The barrage was so intense that seismographs in Switzerland recorded it as an earthquake. In London, 200 miles away, residents reported hearing distant thunder on a cloudless morning. Dugdale's trench simply ceased to exist, along with most of his platoon, vaporized in the opening minutes of the largest artillery bombardment in human history to that point. What Dugdale couldn't know, as he tried to process what was happening through the concussive fog of 9,000 tons of high-explosive landing every hour, was that he was experiencing the opening moves of Germany's final gamble, one last desperate offensive designed by General Erich Ludendorff, a man who'd calculated that Germany had exactly 4 months to win the war before American reinforcements made victory impossible. The spring offensive would gain more ground in a single day than 3 years of previous offensives combined. It would come within 40 miles of Paris. For 2 weeks, it would look like Germany might actually win, and then it would fail so catastrophically that Germany would collapse completely within 8 months. Erich Ludendorff was not technically in command of the German army in 1918, but everyone knew he ran the war. As First Quartermaster General, a title that sounds like he managed supply logistics, but actually meant he was the de facto military dictator of Germany, Ludendorff had spent 3 years transforming the German military into the most efficient killing machine in history, while simultaneously watching that machine slowly bleed to death. By early 1918, he faced a mathematical problem that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. Germany was losing. The British naval blockade had reduced German civilians to eating turnips and sawdust bread. The army was down to teenagers and men over 40. Morale was collapsing. Strikes were spreading. And worst of all, American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month. Fresh soldiers from a country with unlimited industrial capacity and no war exhaustion. Ludendorff calculated that by summer 1918, the Allies would have numerical superiority so overwhelming that Germany's defeat would be inevitable. He had one option: attack in spring, before the Americans arrived in force, break through the Allied lines, and win the war in a single campaign. It was desperate. It was brilliant. It was probably going to fail. He ordered it anyway. His confidence came from a singular stroke of luck on the other side of the continent. Russia had collapsed into revolution and sued for peace, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. For the first time since 1914, Germany didn't have to fight a two-front war. Ludendorff immediately began shipping nearly 50 divisions from the frozen east to the Western Front. It was a massive transfusion of manpower, shifting the balance of power for one brief, fleeting moment. But Ludendorff knew that simply throwing more bodies at British machine guns was just a sophisticated way of committing suicide. The horrors of the Somme and Verdun had proven that mass infantry waves against entrenched defenses didn't work. To break the deadlock, he needed to reinvent war itself. He turned to a new tactical doctrine that traded mass for speed. The German army began training elite units known as Sturmtruppen, stormtroopers. These weren't the rigid formations of 1914. These men were lightly equipped, armed with bags of grenades, trench knives, and flamethrowers. Their orders were radical. Do not stop. If they hit a British strongpoint, they were to ignore it, bypass it, and keep running deep into the rear lines to sever communications and cause chaos, leaving them mopping up for the regular infantry following behind. It was infiltration tactics on a massive scale, designed to paralyze the enemy command structure before they could even pick up the phone to call for reinforcements. Backing them was the terrifying genius of Colonel Georg Bruchmüller, an artillery officer who orchestrated guns like instruments in an orchestra. Instead of the week-long bombardments that churned the ground to mud and warned the enemy an attack was coming, Bruchmüller perfected a short, intense hurricane of fire. He mixed high explosives with gas shells, tear gas to force the British to take off their masks, followed by lethal phosgene to kill them when they vomited. On the eve of March 21st, 1918, millions of men and thousands of guns sat in the silence of the pre-dawn fog. Ludendorff had his men, his tactics, and his window of opportunity. The Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, was about to begin. It was the last throw of the dice. Let's talk about the strategic situation Germany faced in March 1918, because it explains why a defensive war, the sensible option, wasn't actually an option at all. On paper, Germany's position looked almost strong. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed with Russia on March 3, 1918, ended the war on the Eastern Front. Suddenly, Germany could transfer 50 divisions, over 500,000 men, from Russia to France. For the first time since 1914, Germany would have numerical superiority on the Western Front, but this advantage was temporary and shrinking by the day. American troops were landing in France at rates that made German intelligence officers physically ill when they calculated the implications. In January 1918, there were 175,000 American soldiers in France. By April, there would be 500,000. By July, over 1 million. By November, 2 million. Each American division was twice the size of a German division and equipped with unlimited ammunition, food, and supplies. The British naval blockade, meanwhile, was slowly starving Germany to death. Civilian rations in 1918 provided 1,000 calories per day, half of subsistence level. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 had killed an estimated 750,000 German civilians from malnutrition-related diseases. By 1918, German soldiers were malnourished, German factories lacked raw materials, and German civilians were on the edge of revolution. Time was Germany's enemy. Every day the war continued, Germany grew weaker while the Allies grew stronger. Ludendorff looked at these grim statistics and came to a chilling conclusion. A defensive victory was impossible. Sitting in the trenches meant slowly starving while the Americans built an unstoppable army. The only way out was forward. But this wasn't just about military strategy. It was about political survival. To the German High Command, a negotiated peace based on the status quo was unacceptable. After 4 years of sacrifice and millions of dead, the German people would not accept a draw. If the army returned home without victory, the Kaiser's government feared the monarchy itself would collapse under the weight of socialist revolution. They needed a win, a decisive, crushing win, to justify the carnage. So, where do you strike when you have one bullet left in the chamber? Ludendorff analyzed the map of the Western Front, a scar running from Switzerland to the North Sea. He identified the weak point not in the concrete fortifications, but in the human relationships. The British and French armies were allies, but they answered to different masters and prioritized different goals. If pressed hard enough, the British would instinctively retreat north to protect their supply ports on the English Channel, while the French would retreat south to defend Paris. Ludendorff aimed his hammer right, at the seam between them, the Somme. The plan, codenamed Operation Michael, was effectively an all-in bet. It required stripping the rest of the German line bare to create a massive concentration of force. Every available gun, every spare horse, and the best physical specimens of the army were moved to the attack sector. It was a logistical nightmare involving the secret movement of millions of men by night to avoid Allied aerial reconnaissance. The German soldiers knew the stakes. They were hungry and exhausted, often scavenging boots from dead prisoners, but they were told this was the Friedenssturm, the peace offensive. It was one last push to break the British and go home before the American tide drowned them. The math was simple and terrifying. If Operation Michael failed, Germany died. For 3 years, every army on the Western Front had faced the same unsolvable problem. How do you break through defensive positions when machine guns and artillery made frontal assault suicidal? The British solution at the Somme was to shell German positions for a week, then send men forward in neat lines. Result: 60,000 British casualties on the first day for gains measured in yards. The French solution at Verdun was artillery bombardment, so intense it turned the landscape into a moonscape. Result: 700,000 casualties combined and no breakthrough. Ludendorff's solution was completely different, and it came from a relatively unknown captain named Willy Rohr. Rohr had developed infiltration tactics, called Hutier tactics after General Oskar von Hutier, who'd used them successfully, that abandoned the idea of capturing every enemy position. Instead, small units of specially trained stormtroopers would infiltrate through weak points, bypassing strong points entirely, pushing deep into enemy rear areas to create chaos. These stormtroopers were equipped with flamethrowers, grenades, and light machine guns. They moved fast, avoided fights they couldn't win immediately, and targeted command posts, artillery positions, and supply dumps. Behind them, regular infantry would mop up the bypass strongpoints. The tactics had worked spectacularly at Riga in 1917 and Caporetto in Italy. Ludendorff bet everything that they'd work in France too. The secret weapon that transformed the infiltration theory into battlefield reality was the artillery. For years, artillery was meant to destroy trenches, giving the enemy days of warning. Here, the artillery's job was to neutralize. The tactical genius behind this transformation was Colonel Georg Bruchmüller, who perfected a short, devastating bombardment known as the Feuerwalze, the fire waltz. Bruchmüller's barrage had 3 distinct phases. First, gas shells slammed into Allied command and communication centers, paralyzing the enemy leadership. Second, high explosive shells hammered their artillery batteries, silencing the enemy guns. Third, a creeping barrage of shrapnel and tear gas masked the final advance on the front lines. The entire coordinated sequence lasted just a few hours, not days, giving the defenders no time to bring up reserves or even call for counterfire. This created the critical gaps the Sturmtruppen needed to execute their deep thrusts. The creation of these elite shock divisions required a massive hidden effort. Ludendorff stripped the best men from every unit, favoring Eastern Front veterans who already knew how to fight fluidly, and put them through intense training. These stormtroopers were the most physically capable, well-fed, and well-equipped men left in the German army, a stark contrast to the malnourished teenagers holding the quiet sectors. Their success would rely not just on tactics and hardware, but on the element of utter surprise. By March 20th, 1918, 76 divisions, the entire striking force of the German Empire, were crammed into the attack sector along the Somme. As the final hours counted down, an immense, eerie silence fell over the front. Then, just before 4:40 a.m. on March 21st, the dense fog that Ludendorff had prayed for settled heavily over the trenches. It was the perfect cloak. Then, Bruchmüller gave the signal, and over 6,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously in a hellish, coordinated eruption. The war's greatest gamble had begun. The plan Ludendorff created was called Operation Michael, and on paper it was devastatingly clever. The target was the British Fifth Army, holding a 50-mile front along the Somme River. This section of line was the boundary between British and French forces, the seam where 2 different armies, with different command structures, different languages, and decades of mutual suspicion met. Military history teaches that seams are where armies break. Hit the junction point hard enough, and instead of two armies supporting each other, you get two armies each assuming the other will handle the crisis while both retreat. The British Fifth Army was also the weakest link for practical reasons. They'd only taken over this sector from French forces in January 1918. They hadn't had time to build proper defensive depth. Their trenches were incomplete, their wire thin, their bunkers shallow. They were stretched thin, holding 50 miles with 12 divisions, a front that should have required 20. General Hubert Gough, commanding the Fifth Army, had repeatedly warned his superiors that his position was vulnerable. He was ignored. Ludendorff knew all this from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. Operation Michael would smash through the Fifth Army, drive west toward the vital railway junction at Amiens, and split the British from the French. Once separated, the British would retreat toward the Channel ports to protect their line of supply and retreat. The French would fall back to protect Paris. The alliance would shatter. Germany would win. To execute this, the Germans engaged in one of the most complex acts of Maskirovka, military deception, in history. Ludendorff didn't just need to move 750,000 men. He had to do it invisibly. The roads behind the German lines became rivers of grey humanity that flowed only at night. By day, the roads were strictly empty, with soldiers hiding in woods and barns to evade Allied aerial scouts. Artillery wheels were wrapped in rags to muffle the sound of their movement on cobblestones. It was a phantom army, materializing in the darkness and vanishing at dawn. On the other side of the wire, the British High Command was suffering from a fatal case of confirmation bias. Field Marshal Douglas Haig was convinced the Germans would attack further north, near Arras, where the ground was harder and strategically more valuable for threatening the Channel ports. He viewed the Somme sector as a quiet zone, a place to rest battered divisions. When Gough presented evidence of the massive German build-up, the sounds of wagon wheels at night, the fresh earth of new trench works visible in aerial photos, he was dismissed as a nervous alarmist. The vital British reserves were held far back in the north, guarding the wrong door. However, for all its cleverness, Operation Michael contained a dangerous ambiguity. While the objective was to split the Allies at Amiens, Ludendorff's operational philosophy was surprisingly fluid. Unlike modern commanders who obsess over rigid timelines, Ludendorff believed in the supremacy of violence over geography. His motto for the offensive was chillingly simple: "We chop a hole, the rest follows." He believed that if he could just smash the enemy line hard enough, the resulting chaos would dictate the strategy. He wasn't aiming to capture a specific hill as much as he was aiming to annihilate the British capacity to resist. As the heavy fog rolled in on the night of March 20th, concealing the German assembly areas, the trap was fully set. The British Fifth Army slept in their shallow trenches, unaware that the hammer was already swinging down. At 4:40 a.m. on March 21st, 1918, the largest artillery bombardment in history began. 6,000 German guns opened fire across a 50-mile front. The British positions weren't just shelled, they were obliterated. German artillery doctrine in 1918 had evolved beyond simple destruction. They used a sophisticated mix of high explosive, gas, and smoke. High explosive destroyed trenches, bunkers, and wire. Gas forced British soldiers into masks that made communication and fighting difficult. Smoke blinded observation posts and made counter-battery fire impossible. The bombardment lasted 5 hours and consumed more ammunition than Germany had fired in the entire Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. British soldiers who survived described it as hell made manifest. Trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Gas shells turned dugouts into death traps. Communications were severed within minutes. Telephone lines cut. Runners killed. commanders blind to what was happening. At 9:40 a.m., the bombardment lifted and moved deeper. 47 German divisions, 750,000 men, rose from their trenches and advanced into the fog. The stormtroopers led, moving in small groups, exploiting gaps, bypassing resistance. Behind them came waves of regular infantry. The British Fifth Army, blind, deafened, and isolated, simply disintegrated. Nature itself seemed to have enlisted in the German cause. A dense, heavy mist hung over the battlefield, reducing visibility to less than 20 yards. For the defenders, this was catastrophic. The British defensive doctrine relied heavily on interlocking fields of machine gun fire to strip away infantry attacks. But you cannot shoot what you cannot see. Isolated British outposts in the forward zone stared into the grey void, waiting for targets, only to hear the crunch of boots behind them. The stormtroopers had simply walked past them in the mist, appearing like ghosts to toss grenades into trench lines from the rear. Entire battalions were surrounded and forced to surrender without ever firing a shot in their own defense. By noon, the situation had evolved from a tactical defeat into a strategic calamity. In previous battles like the Somme or Passchendaele, a breakthrough meant advancing a few hundred yards to capture a ruined farmhouse. By the afternoon of March 21st, German units had advanced nearly 5 miles. They weren't just taking trenches. They were overrunning artillery batteries that were supposed to be safely in the rear. British gunners, stripping to their waists, fired their field guns over open sights at point-blank range before being swarmed. The battle zone, the main line of British resistance, had been breached in multiple places. Back at General Gough's headquarters, the fog of war was literal. With telephone lines shredded by the bombardment, reports were non-existent or hours old. When news finally did arrive, it was panic-inducing. The front line was gone. By nightfall, the British Fifth Army had suffered terrible losses. Nearly 21,000 soldiers had been taken prisoner in a single day, a number that shocked the Allied command. The impossible had happened. The deadlock of the Western Front, frozen in mud and blood for 4 years, had been broken. The Germans were in the open. The race for Amiens was on. For 3 days, Operation Michael worked better than anyone had imagined. By the evening of March 21st, German forces had advanced 8 miles more progress than 3 months of fighting at the Somme had achieved. By March 23rd, they'd advanced 20 miles and captured 50,000 British prisoners, along with hundreds of guns. British Fifth Army headquarters abandoned their positions and retreated in chaos. Gough's command structure collapsed. Units lost contact with each other and with higher command. Some battalions retreated in good order. Others simply dissolved, with men streaming westward in small groups. The Germans captured entire supply dumps, intact warehouses full of food, ammunition, equipment. Starving German soldiers, accustomed to black bread and thin soup, found British stores stocked with white bread, tinned meat, chocolate, and cigarettes. Some units stopped advancing to loot. Others kept pushing west. For a brief, glorious moment, it looked like Germany might actually win the war. French and British reserves rushed toward the breakthrough, but Ludendorff's forces were advancing faster than the Allies could respond. The stormtrooper tactics were working perfectly. German cavalry, unused since 1914, prepared to exploit the breakthrough. After 3 years of stalemate, the Western Front was finally breaking open. The panic wasn't confined to the trenches. It reached the highest levels of the Allied command. On March 24th, the Kaiser declared a national holiday, giving school children the day off to celebrate the inevitable victory. Meanwhile, the British commander Field Marshal Haig and the French commander General Pétain were on the verge of losing the war, not because of soldiers, but because of politics. As Ludendorff had predicted, the alliance began to fracture. Pétain, terrified that the Germans would pivot south, issued orders to prepare the French army to fall back and cover Paris, effectively abandoning the British. Haig, seeing his ally pulling away, prepared to retreat toward the English Channel. The seam was ripping apart. It took a frantic emergency conference at the town of Doullens on March 26th to save the Allies from themselves. Realizing that divided command was suicide, British and French politicians finally agreed to appoint a single supreme commander to coordinate the defense, General Ferdinand Foch. Foch, a man of aggressive spirit, famously declared, "I would fight in front of Amiens, I would fight in Amiens, I would fight behind Amiens." His appointment finally plugged the command gap, forcing the French and British to hold the line together rather than retreat apart. But even as the Allies rallied, the Germans unleashed a new psychological terror. On March 23rd, shells began falling on Paris from the stratosphere. The Germans had deployed the Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz, the Paris gun. It was a technological marvel with a range of 75 miles, firing shells so high they entered the vacuum of space before crashing down on the terrified city. It was a symbol of German dominance. They were advancing on the ground, and they could strike the enemy capital from the air. Yet, amidst the looting of British chocolate and the shelling of Paris, a subtle friction was building. The German infantry was moving so fast they were outrunning their own supply wagons, and they were now marching into a wasteland of their own making, the cratered, destroyed landscape of the 1916 Somme battlefield, where horses broke their legs and artillery wheels sank into the mud. The speed of the advance was becoming its own worst enemy. The problem with Operation Michael became apparent by late March. It was succeeding tactically, but failing strategically. The offensive had gained territory, captured prisoners, and created panic in Allied high command. But it hadn't accomplished its actual objective, splitting the British from the French and forcing Allied surrender. The British were retreating, but not breaking. The French were rushing reinforcements north, not falling back to protect Paris. Most critically, the German advance was creating a massive salient, a bulge in the line that required more and more troops to defend, even as casualties mounted from continuous fighting. Ludendorff had designed Operation Michael to break through and exploit, but he'd never clearly defined what exploit meant. Once through the initial British positions, German units received vague orders to push west without specific objectives. Some headed for Amiens, the logical strategic target. Others veered south toward Péronne or north toward Arras, following lines of least resistance rather than strategic necessity. The result was German forces spreading out like a flood, covering ground but losing cohesion and concentration. The stormtroopers, trained for breakthrough, found themselves fighting a pursuit battle they weren't equipped for. Supply lines stretched. Artillery fell behind the advance. By April 5th, when Operation Michael finally stopped, the Germans had created a bulge 40 miles deep, but hadn't captured any strategically decisive objectives. The magnitude of this failure is best illustrated by the fate of Amiens. This railway hub was the jugular vein of the British logistical network in France. If Amiens fell, the British army would be severed from its supply base and likely forced to evacuate the continent. By late March, German troops were within heavy artillery range of the city. They could literally see the cathedral spire through their binoculars. Yet, they never took it. Why? Because Ludendorff, drunk on the rapid advances happening further south, diverted crucial reserves away from Amiens to exploit meaningless gaps elsewhere. He was chasing red lines on a map rather than the war-winning objective, violating the cardinal rule of strategy, maintenance of the objective. Furthermore, the geography of the Western Front exacted a cruel irony. To advance, the Germans had to cross the old Somme battlefield of 1916, a desolate, cratered moonscape that they themselves had scorched during their retreat to the Hindenburg Line a year earlier. There were no roads, only mud and shell holes. The German supply system, still heavily reliant on horses, because the blockade had starved Germany of rubber for truck tires, collapsed in this wasteland. Horses died by the thousands from exhaustion and lack of fodder. The heavy artillery, the essential partner to the infantry, got stuck in the mire, unable to keep pace with the advance. As a result, the exhausted stormtroopers found themselves attacking stiffening Allied defences with nothing but the rifles and grenades they could carry on their backs. The human cost of this victory was unsustainable. Operation Michael cost Germany nearly 240,000 casualties in just over 2 weeks. Crucially, these weren't just random losses. They were the best men Germany had left. The Sturmtruppen led every assault, meaning they took the brunt of the fire. With every mile gained, the German army became duller, stripping away its elite tip and leaving behind tired, hungry conscripts who lacked the training to maintain the momentum. They had punched a massive hole in the Allied line, but instead of walking through it to victory, they had merely stretched their own neck into a noose. Ludendorff's response to Operation Michael's failure was to launch more offensives. If one breakthrough didn't work, maybe 4 would. Operation Georgette targeted British positions in Flanders in April. Operation Blücher York hit French forces at the Aisne River in May. Operation Gneisenau followed in June. Each offensive gained ground. Initially, the infiltration tactics still worked, but each failed to achieve decisive results. The pattern repeated: successful breakthrough, rapid advance, then gradual slowdown as supplies ran out, reserves arrived, and German forces exhausted themselves. By June 1918, Germany had advanced up to 40 miles in places, captured 225,000 prisoners, and created panic in Paris. But they hadn't won. Worse, each offensive bled strength Germany couldn't replace. The stormtroopers, the elite units leading each attack, suffered casualty rates of 50% or higher. These were Germany's best soldiers, the veterans and specialists who made the tactics work. Each offensive consumed them. Behind the advancing Germans came fresh American divisions. In May alone, 245,000 American troops arrived in France. By June, they were entering combat. At Château Thierry and Belleau Wood, American Marines stopped German advances cold in brutal close quarters fighting. The psychological impact of these American encounters cannot be overstated. For 4 years, German soldiers had fought opponents who were as weary and cynical as they were. Suddenly, they were facing men who were physically larger, well-fed, and recklessly aggressive. German intelligence reports from Belleau Wood noted with horror that the Americans didn't seem to know when to retreat. They attacked with a naive, terrifying enthusiasm that the jaded Europeans had lost years ago. For the starving German soldier, looting an American pack and finding white bread, canned beef, and good coffee was a final crushing proof of the enemy's limitless resources. While Germany was melting down church bells to make bullets, the Americans were arriving with seemingly infinite supplies. Complicating matters was the fact that Ludendorff's victories were actually strategic disasters. Operation Blücher York in May, for instance, was originally intended only as a diversion to draw French reserves away from the British front. But when the German stormtroopers smashed through the lines at the Chemin des Dames with unexpected ease, advancing 12 miles in a single day, Ludendorff couldn't help himself. He abandoned the strategic plan to chase the tactical success. He poured more troops into the breach, driving them toward Paris. They got close enough to see the Eiffel Tower, but they were now stuck in a deep, narrow salient that was a nightmare to supply. He had spent his reserves capturing territory that held no strategic value, stretching his lines to the breaking point. Then, an invisible enemy joined the fray. In June 1918, the first wave of the Spanish flu swept through the trenches. While it affected all armies, it devastated the Germans. Their immune systems, weakened by years of the turnip diet and malnutrition caused by the blockade, collapsed. In some units, 80% of the men were too sick to stand. let alone fight. The offensive spirit that had powered the spring attacks evaporated in a haze of fever and coughing. By July, Ludendorff wasn't commanding an army. He was commanding a hospital ward. He stood over the map table, a gambler who had lost his fortune but was frantically searching his pockets for one last coin to throw on the table, refusing to accept that the game was already over. On August 8, 1918, the Allies counterattacked at Amiens with tactics that mirrored German infiltration methods, but added something Germany couldn't match: unlimited resources. British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, supported by 456 tanks and 800 aircraft, smashed through German positions in a coordinated assault that combined infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in ways that prefigured World War II. The Germans fell back in disorder. For the first time, German units surrendered en masse without serious fighting. Ludendorff called August 8th the Black Day of the German army, not because of casualties, though 27,000 Germans were captured, but because of morale collapse. German soldiers, seeing fresh Allied divisions with new equipment and unlimited ammunition, simply stopped believing they could win. The spring offensive had consumed Germany's strategic reserves, killed its best soldiers, and gained nothing decisive. Now the Allies were counterattacking with armies that grew stronger every day, while Germany grew weaker. The mathematics Ludendorff had tried to outrun in March finally caught up. From August 8th forward, the German army retreated continuously, fighting delaying actions, surrendering territory bought with blood just months earlier. The success of the Allied attack wasn't just about brute force. It was a masterpiece of operational secrecy. For the first time, there was no multi-day artillery bombardment to warn the Germans of an impending assault. Instead, the Allies utilized sound ranging and aerial photography to pinpoint German batteries, allowing them to fire immediately for effect at the 0 hour. As the mist cleared that morning, German machine gunners looked out not to see waves of walking infantry, but hundreds of steel monsters rolling toward them. The heavy Mark V tanks crushed barbed wire that had previously taken weeks to cut with artillery, while the faster Whippet cavalry tanks raced into the rear, wreaking havoc on headquarters and transport lines. The German anti-tank defenses were scarce and ineffective, leading to immediate panic. What terrified the German high command most was not the loss of territory they had traded land for time before, but the complete disintegration of discipline. This was the true Black Day. When reserve officers tried to march fresh units to the front to plug the gaps, they were met by retreating columns of their own men shouting insults. "Strike breakers and war prolongers," they jeered, using the language of industrial disputes to describe the conflict. This was a psychological break. The German army ceased to be a unified instrument of the Kaiser's will and became a collection of exhausted, disillusioned individuals who realized they were dying for a lost cause. The devastating casualty rates of the spring offensive had killed the most patriotic and aggressive soldiers. Only the conscripts and the cynical survivors remained. Ludendorff, the man of iron will who had dictated the war effort for years, began to crack. He reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown in the days following Amiens, his hands shaking so violently he could barely sign orders. He understood better than anyone that the spring offensive had been a fatal paradox. By attacking, he had hastened the end. He had traded his army's defensive integrity for a salient he couldn't hold, effectively spending his last chips on a losing hand. The gamble was definitively lost. The German army was no longer capable of an offensive operation, nor could it hold a static line against the swelling American numbers. The 100 Days Offensive had begun, and the road to the armistice was now a one-way street of defeat. The spring offensive didn't just fail, it guaranteed Germany's total defeat by consuming the last reserves of strength Germany possessed. The offensives cost Germany approximately 800,000 casualties, including irreplaceable stormtrooper specialists and experienced NCOs. These losses came from units Germany couldn't replace, while facing American divisions arriving at 250,000 per month. The territorial gains up to 40 miles in places created salients that required more troops to defend than Germany had available. When the Allied counter-offensives began in July, German forces were overextended, exhausted, and demoralized. The rapid collapse that followed wasn't inevitable in early 1918. It became inevitable because Ludendorff gambled everything on offensives that gained ground, but cost more than Germany could afford. By November 1918, the German army was retreating across Belgium. Revolution erupted in Germany. The Kaiser abdicated. The war ended not with a final stand, but with complete political and military collapse. Ludendorff's genius tactics had worked perfectly. His strategy had failed catastrophically. He'd proven you could break the trench stalemate with infiltration tactics, but also proven that breakthrough without decisive objectives just bleeds your army white. The spring offensive was brilliant, desperate, and ultimately suicidal, exactly like the general who ordered it. The strategic math was undeniable. Ludendorff had spent 800,000 of his best soldiers and gained nothing more than a few unusable, overextended patches of ruined ground. The Allies, meanwhile, were finally fighting with the full might of the United States. Between July and November 1918, the American expeditionary forces contributed over 1.2 million fresh, well-supplied and highly motivated soldiers to the final Allied push. Ludendorff had exchanged irreplaceable German quality for temporary gains against an opponent who possessed an inexhaustible, fresh supply of both men and resources. The German High Command watched in despair as the Americans simply plugged every gap and pushed continuously forward. The final act of recklessness came in late September 1918. Recognizing the army was broken, not defeated by a final battle, but simply exhausted and unable to move, Ludendorff shocked the German government. The man who had refused all previous calls for peace suddenly demanded an immediate armistice based on President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Crucially, he demanded that the civilian government be the one to sign the surrender, not the military. This seemingly small political move was, in reality, a deliberate piece of deception designed to shift the blame for the defeat away from the military high command. This created the toxic myth that poisoned Germany's future, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend. Ludendorff and his conservative allies claimed the German army hadn't been defeated in the field, but had been stabbed in the back by treacherous socialists, communists, and Jews on the home front, the politicians who signed the armistice, the November criminals. This corrosive fiction allowed the military to preserve its honor and avoid accountability, while laying the groundwork for the extremist political movements that would rise in the 1920s, ultimately leading to Adolf Hitler and the Second World War. In the end, the spring offensive was the most expensive learning experience in history. The Allies, particularly the French and Americans, watched the success of the infiltration tactics and the catastrophic failure of the German logistics. They realized that breakthrough required not only Sturmtruppen, but also tanks, motorized supply trucks, and aircraft to maintain momentum. The mobile, lightning warfare that Germany attempted and failed at in 1918 became the precise blueprint for the blitzkrieg that Germany executed with terrifying success 20 years later. Ludendorff's genius was not in winning the war, but in showing the entire world how the next one would be fought, even as he ensured his own nation lost the first.